Hello, friends. We are interested in the geography of our views, so please like and write in the comments from which city are you watching us, and were there loud stories of betrayal in your city? Perhaps the next story about betrayal will be from your city, and we start. Nick woke up as usual at 5:30 am. In the darkness of the bedroom, the first thing he did was feel for the smartphone on the nightstand, a habit left over from his days as a police officer, when every minute could decide the fate of the investigation. Now he served in the FBI, but the habit of staying on his toes had not gone away. I took a quick look at the screen. Email, a couple of notifications from the work messenger, nothing urgent. He sat down on the edge of the bed, stretched and closed his eyes for a second. A little to the left, under a warm blanket, his wife Sarah was dozing. More precisely, she pretended to be dozing. Nick felt some tension in the way she lay with her face turned to the wall. Over the past few weeks, she has generally become colder and more distant. He tried to blame it on her workload and fatigue. Sarah worked at a local startup related to medical equipment. It had its own rush jobs, deadlines, and burning projects. But more and more often, he noticed that she was not so tired, but rather irritated and avoiding communication. Nick stood up quietly, trying not to break the floorboards. The house was cool as the fall weather in the northern part of the state was beginning to take its toll. He quickly threw on an old flannel shirt, went into the kitchen, and put water on the boil for coffee. Scraps of thoughts were spinning in my head. Reports, business, an operational meeting that was scheduled for today at 8 am. But on top of all this, anxious feelings about Sarah stubbornly surfaced. Maybe everything will improve if you take a vacation and go somewhere for a week. Go to the ocean, walk together along the long sandy beach, talk again about the future, about the past, about plans. Having prepared the coffee, he inhaled the aroma, trying to catch calm, and headed to the window. The dawn was barely gray behind the glass. Rare cars drove by the area was quiet, family-friendly, where they moved a little over 3 years ago after Nick received a promotion. Sarah was happy with a change then because the new house offered space, a good kitchen, and a comfortable bedroom on the second floor where she could set up a small work area. They were delighted, made repairs, and bought furniture. Everything seemed to work out easily together. Now every day began with awkward silence. Nick and Sarah hardly spoke in the morning. He got up first, went to drink coffee, she stayed in bed until the last minute, then quickly got ready, and they each went their separate ways. A rustle behind him distracted him from his thoughts. Sarah entered the kitchen, wrapping herself in a long terry robe. "Hello," she said, her voice sounding hoarse and a little tired. "Good morning," Nick answered, trying to smile. "How did you sleep?" She nodded absently, went to the sink, and poured herself some water. Nick handed her a cup of freshly brewed coffee, but she just waved her hand. "I don't want coffee. Then I'll grab a latte on the way." "Okay," he nodded, realizing that the conversation was unlikely to progress further. There was a short pause. Sarah immediately looked down at her phone, checking her notifications. Nick noticed how her eyebrows furrowed slightly. It seemed that she saw something unpleasant or causing concern. But she quickly locked the screen and threw the phone into her robe pocket. "Will you be back late today?" he asked, trying to add friendliness to his voice. "Most likely, yes. We have some kind of meetings there, I don't know for sure. At a startup, everything is as usual. Sarah, I need it urgently," she mimicked the boss, as if imitating his mentoring tone. "You may have to stay longer. I'll figure it out myself. Don't wait for me for dinner, okay?" Nick wanted to say something like, "No problem, I'll cook something and heat it up when you get back," but internal anxiety held him back. He noticed that Sarah was staying late more and more often. This was the 5th or 6th time in the last 2 weeks. He swallowed the lump in his throat and simply nodded. "Of course, don't worry." Sarah nodded briefly in response, turned and left the kitchen, leaving behind the morning coolness and an elusive feeling of emptiness. Half an hour later, Nick drove his car out of the garage. A black SUV, reliable, although not the newest. He was accustomed to the fact that transport is, first of all, a tool for work. Once upon a time in the police, he was given service sedans with minimal comfort, and now he did not pay attention to how much horsepower was under the hood or how modern his multimedia system was. If only everything was in order. The journey to the FBI office took about half an hour at this time. The main traffic jams began later. Did he think about work? Yes, but thoughts about Sarah popped up in my head over and over again, like a beacon that could not be ignored. Some little things haunted her. Her constant conversations with someone on the phone, quiet notifications in messaging applications that she tried to hide. Her new habit was to go out into the corridor or onto the street if she suddenly received a call in the evening. Excuses like, "it's for work," became less and less convincing. Stopping at a traffic light, Nick ran his hand through his short hair. It was unusual for him to feel vulnerable. Once upon a time, he learned to notice every detail at a crime scene, read the faces of suspects, and prepare for unpredictable situations. But what to do when something wrong happens in your own family? Too much personal, too much emotion. He felt that the more he tried to bring all this into conversation, the more Sarah retreated into herself. And the quieter she becomes, the louder the anxiety inside him screams. The FBI office was located in a simple beige building without unnecessary pomp. Nick parked in the service parking lot and showed his ID at the entrance. He was invited to the bureau after several years of successful work in the local police department, specializing in the investigation of cases related to fraud and cybercrimes. The FBI gave him a chance to open up further. Now he was part of a small team of analysts and operatives involved in large-scale deception schemes, hacker attacks, and data leaks. "Hey, Nick," called his colleague, a young agent named Harris. He waved his hand and smiled. "We were waiting for you here. Meeting in 20 minutes. Can you give me some numbers on the forgery case?" "Of course," Nick nodded. "Give me 5 minutes." He walked to his workplace. A neat desk, a couple of closed folders, a computer with a secure access system. Nick turned on the car and entered his username and password. A list of emails awaited the screen, a few from the investigations department, a couple of office notes. He scanned quickly, highlighting the necessary information in reports. Thoughts of Sarah receded briefly as he immersed himself in his work, but they didn't leave completely. Insecurity, the feeling that something was slipping away, remained in the background. Nick had to control himself so as not to pry into his wife's personal life through some unethical moves. He knew he could check her phone if he wanted to gather information, but that went against his principles, and after all, he loved Sarah and didn't want to play spy. In operational activities, on the contrary, he was valued precisely for his ability to search for facts. Today, they had to discuss several cases, including a high-profile case involving the use of fake passports for smuggling. After a short gathering, he and Harris went to the conference room, where the rest of the group had already gathered. A quick greeting, a few jokes about how everyone hates Monday mornings, and the meeting began. The head of the department, Agent Broker, a short, middle-aged man with sharp features, presented new materials. Nick, listening to him, took notes. The conversation smoothly turned into questions about how to track the producers of false documents and whether there was a connection with a gang that had previously been involved in similar operations. Nick analyzed, asked clarifying questions, realizing that on a normal day he would have been immersed in these details. But today I couldn't fully concentrate. Memories popped up in my head about how yesterday Sarah returned around 11 in the evening, citing an important meeting with a possible investor, and almost didn't talk to him before going to bed. "Nick, are you with me?" Broker suddenly asked, tearing Nick away from his thoughts. "Yes, sorry, I was thinking a little," Nick answered, straightening up. "We can launch a check on old dossiers on smugglers in neighboring states. I think it makes sense to look at the patterns. If this is the same group, it can act according to the pattern already mentioned 2 years ago." With these words, he began to share his thoughts, and his colleagues listened more attentively. Nick was known for his ability to find connections and patterns where other agents were lost in the huge volume of data. This was appreciated in him, and this largely helped him behave confidently when overcoming difficulties. But already at the end of the meeting, he understood. Personal affairs would not give him peace until he found out what was really going on with Sarah. In the afternoon, he went out for a short lunch, a regular burger at a cafe nearby, and a glass of soda. Agent's favorite place, not too crowded, but decent enough to grab a quick bite and head back to the office. Sitting at a table by the window, Nick took out his phone and looked to see if anyone had texted him. A couple of messages from a childhood friend, one from an old police friend, an advertising newsletter. But Sarah was not on the list. After hesitating, he finally decided to write, "Hello, how was your morning at work? Did you forget lunch?" As the seconds passed, he looked at the screen and saw that the message had been delivered, but no one was typing a response. I looked up and saw cars passing by outside the window. Another 3 or 4 minutes, no reaction. Finally, he put the phone back in his pocket. "Is everything okay, buddy?" asked Harris, who sat down next to him with a tray. "Yes, I'm just stuck at work," Nick lied, not wanting to tell anyone about his family problems. "Tell me," Harris smiled. "Listen, if you're worried about the new case, then you're in vain. We can handle it. Although the volume of information is truly insane, no one can sort it out alone. Just a little tired." "It wasn't a good couple of nights," Nick answered evasively. "I understand." Harris delicately did not delve further into his soul, switching to discussing work nuances. Nick felt grateful that there was an unspoken rule in the department. Personal things should not be made public unless the person is willing to share. In the police, it used to be that employees often told each other stories, but there was still a lot of internal competition, the struggle for promotion. At the FBI, everything looked a little different, a more corporate culture, but also a more sensitive attitude towards personal boundaries. Nick devoted the rest of the day to studying materials on his case. He sat with his eyes glued to the screen, checking data, creating an electronic map of connections. Sometimes it seemed to him that he was very calmly, intently understanding the intricacies of criminal schemes, while in his own family he could not find a clear picture. And the more he tried to concentrate on work, the more acutely he felt that the problem at home could develop into something serious. "Well, what do I want?" he asked himself. "To come home and conduct an interrogation, like an investigator with a suspect? This is Sarah, my wife, whom I trust, whom I love. Should it come to espionage?" Thoughts about this imperceptibly flowed into the question. Or maybe there really is someone else? Or is she having a nervous breakdown? Or even health problems that she is hiding? He felt a lot of hypotheses, but none seemed sufficiently substantiated, and each brought with it a new wave of anxiety. The working day came to an end around 7 in the evening. Nick packed his things and sent his last letters. He looked around. Harris had already left. The broker had locked himself in his office, finishing his report. Nick took a breath and rubbed his tired eyes. He left the office building, got into the car, and drove home along his usual route. The road was illuminated by street lamps. Autumn leaves fell onto the side of the road. The question was burning inside. What should I do when I'm home? Sarah said she'll be late. Should I write to her again or wait? As he approached the house, he noted the absence of Sarah's car in the garage. That meant she was gone. He drove the SUV inside, got out, looked at his watch. 1948. About 8 o'clock in the evening. Nothing supernatural, but not an early arrival either. Nick opened the front door, turned on the hallway light, took off his shoes, and hung his jacket on the hook. He walked into the living room and looked around the quiet space. The same house where there was once so much joint plans and joy. There was a stack of Sarah's papers on the kitchen table that looked like she'd left them there in the morning. Some advertisement for leadership training, a couple of letters, perhaps from a bank. Nick mechanically pushed the envelopes aside to make room. He decided to start dinner. I cooked rice, heated up the chicken leftover from yesterday, and chopped some vegetables. He put all this on a plate, not feeling much appetite, but realizing that skipping dinner was a bad idea. While everything was getting ready, I tried to turn on the radio in the background, but after a minute I realized that I didn't want to listen to the news about another scandal at the top of the state and switched to quiet music. Finally, at 20:30, he sat down at the table. A tense emptiness reigned in the apartment. Only quiet notes flowed from the speakers. Nick looked at his smartphone. There were no incoming messages from Sarah. He thought, delay again, or maybe I should go to her work and surprise her. But such a thought seemed too suspicious to him and would betray jealousy. In the end, he finished his work day later than usual, and in her office they could easily sit until the night startups are like that. People work there without rest. Around 9 o'clock in the evening, the phone finally vibrated. Message from Sarah. Don't wait, we're still working, I'll be back late. No smileys, no clarifications, not even the word sorry. Nick sighed and automatically answered with a short, okay. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. Nick still didn't see a convincing reason not to believe her, because she had said more than once that they had a crisis in the project. The whole team was in a state of emergency. However, Sarah's behavior this morning, a cold look, a constant phone in her hands, a certain swarm of emotions that she seemed to have difficulty holding back, all this spoke of something more than just workload. Not knowing what to do with himself, Nick decided to turn on the computer in the living room and look through a couple of work articles. Then he switched to a series of videos that he and Sarah had watched a long time ago, short videos about traveling through national parks. Memories stung him painfully. How many times have they wanted to organize a trip to Yellowstone or head to the coast, rent a small motorhome and travel halfway across the country? Once upon a time, it was a symbol of freedom and a shared future for them. At about 11 in the evening, he heard his neighbor's dog barking in the yard, which meant someone was driving or passing by the house. Nick suddenly realized that Sarah had already arrived later than that time. He involuntarily stood up and went to the window. Soon, the familiar sound of an engine was heard as Sarah's car appeared in the driveway. Headlights illuminated the facade. A few seconds later, the front door slammed. A cold evening wind rushed into the house, sliding off the threshold and disappearing into the corridor. Sarah came in, wrapped in her thin scarf. In her hands, she held a phone, a bag, and a folder with papers that barely fit under her arm. Fatigue was visible on her face, but something nervous flashed in her gaze, as if she had already anticipated Nick's questions and was looking for the strength to resist them in advance. Hi, Nick tried to smile, trying to speak softly so as not to scare her. How was your day? Okay, Sarah responded without much interest, taking off her light jacket and automatically hanging it on a hook. She spoke evenly, almost monotonously, but in this normal, Nick heard everything except normality. I'm very tired. You don't have to ask for details, I just want to shower and go to bed. She turned away, and for a second Nick saw her shoulders sag under the weight of something invisible, not just fatigue. He stood in the middle of the hallway, clutching the edge of his sweater, as if trying to resist the urge to rush towards her. Okay, he squeezed out, feeling that nasty knot tightening in his chest again. I prepared dinner, it's in the refrigerator. If you want, warm it up. Sarah paused at the stairs, as if hesitating. She slowly turned to him. There was confusion on her face and a faint twinkle of guilt in her eyes. Thank you, but I'm not hungry at all. She threw the phone on the nightstand, and it slid a little further, hitting the wall. Sarah didn't even seem to notice. Sorry, Nick. It's just, I'm really not in the mood. Her voice trembled, but the next second she was already taking the first step onto the stairs. Sarah, he called quietly, almost in a whisper. She stopped, but didn't turn around. You know you can tell me anything. You don't have to carry everything yourself. I know, she answered quickly, but there was no confidence in her voice. Just not now, okay? Nick remained standing below, watching her rise up. Every step she took sounded like a dull thud in his heart. He heard the bedroom door quietly close behind her, and a heavy lump of helplessness and fear grew in his chest. He imagined how she was now sitting on the edge of the bed in the dark, clutching the phone in her hands, maybe deciding to write to someone or just not knowing what to do next. He wanted to follow her, hug her, hold her close, and whisper, Sarah, let's talk. It hurts me to see you leaving me. But he was afraid that one more awkward word would turn into a quarrel, after which there would be even less of her in this house. He sank onto the edge of the sofa, burying his hands in his face, and outside the window, the cold spring rain began to drizzle, mixing with the wind and darkness. A few minutes later, Nick gathered his courage and nevertheless went up to the bedroom. The light in the bathroom was on. He heard the sound of water. Her clothes lay on the bed, thoughtlessly thrown away. Nick sat down on the edge of the mattress and stared at the floor, remembering how a few years ago she had laughed at him for being too neat and always putting things in their place. Then her mess seemed cute to him. He only teased her jokingly. She scattered again like a teenager. She laughed back. Now it felt alienating. The water in the shower turned off. The bathroom door creaked, and a few moments later Sarah came out into the bedroom, draping a large bath towel over her shoulders. The hair still shone from the moisture and stuck to the cheeks and neck. Nick was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the phone screen, but out of the corner of his eye, he immediately noticed her. She seemed to instinctively shift her gaze to the side, avoiding making eye contact with him, as she had been doing more and more often lately. "I'll go to bed," she said tiredly, pulling on her pajamas through the towel. There was a sense of urgency in her movements, as if it was important for her to escape his gaze as quickly as possible. "I need to get some sleep. Tomorrow is also a hard day." "Sarah," Nick finally couldn't stand it, standing up. "Maybe we can talk. I have a feeling that between us, well, something wrong is happening." She froze for a second, holding the edge of the blanket in her hands. Then she took a deep breath and frowned tiredly. "Sorry, but right now I'm not at all in the mood to discuss our marital harmony. We'll talk tomorrow, okay? I can't today." With these words, she almost collapsed on the bed, groaned heavily, and immediately wrapped herself in a blanket, as if erecting a wall between herself and the world. Nick looked at her, standing in the semi-darkness of the bedroom. The light from the corridor softly outlined her figure under the blanket. For a moment, as always, he thought about how much he loved her even on days like this, even in this fatigue. He came closer, sat on the edge of the bed, and gently ran his hand over her shoulder. He missed her warmth, her body so much. They hadn't made love for a long time, 3 weeks, maybe more. This was unusual for them. Previously, there was always an easy intimacy between them, almost without words, but now, everything has changed. He leaned a little closer to her, as if about to hug her. Maybe, at least. He hesitated, not knowing how to say it otherwise. "Let's just stay close. I think we need this." Sarah suddenly pulled the blanket almost up to her chin. "Nick, please. Not today. I'm really tired." Her voice sounded dull, emotionless, almost mechanically. "I just want to sleep." The words hit me hard, like a slap in the face. Nick felt like everything inside was broken. Despair, resentment, and, most importantly, helplessness, everything was mixed up in him. He pulled his hand away and sat back on the edge of the bed. He thought over and over again in his head, when did this start? When did their intimacy become something rare and almost forbidden? At first, he made excuses. Sarah was stressed at work, then fatigue, then stress. But now, looking at her face turned away into the darkness, he thought clearly for the first time. What if it's not just that? Maybe I've already lost her, but I'm just afraid to admit it. He forced himself to exhale with difficulty and, as if giving up, said quietly, "Okay? In the morning, if anything happens, I'll get up early. Good night." "Calm," Sarah answered briefly, without turning around. Her voice was smooth, but not warm. It was as if there really was already a wall between them, not only made of a blanket, but also of something much colder. Nick lay down, staring at the ceiling. He knew he wouldn't fall asleep. Questions, one after another, began to fill his head, and the cold emptiness nearby pressed, more than the darkness in the room. For the next half hour, Nick lay looking at the ceiling. I heard Sarah breathing next to me at first quickly, as if she was angry or nervous. Then the rhythm became slow. Apparently she was falling asleep. The hour hand on the bedside clock moved towards midnight, but he still couldn't relax. Phrases from his previous life naturally began to ring in his head. "If you notice unusual signs, dig deeper." Your powers of observation and instinct are your main tools. He knew he could push her away even further if he got too involved in finding out what was going on. But ignoring all this was stupid and painful. The fatigue of the day and the darkness of doubt gradually overcame him. Nick fell asleep just before dawn. This time the dream was disturbing, interrupted by strange images. He saw Sarah in some dark corridor, where she was talking with a strange man. Then suddenly the picture changed, and he was again at the police dump of evidence, among tons of folders and papers, looking for one single thread that would confirm his guess. When the alarm rang at 5:30, Nick jumped up with the unpleasant feeling that everything he had dreamed was reality, and this reality was on the verge of falling upon him. Sarah continued to sleep with her face buried in her pillow. Nick looked at her. She seemed fragile and vulnerable at that moment, and at the same time, he felt that behind this fragility there was some kind of secret or wall that he could not break through. Still, he loved her. He loved so much that he was afraid of the truth, if the truth turned out to be terrible. Nick dressed in his casual uniform, chinos, shirt, practical boots. He quietly got ready, trying not to wake Sarah. He had literally 20 minutes to leave early for the office and have time to finish the report. Walking through the living room, he glanced at the table. Everything there was the same as the day before. Nick sighed heavily. Perhaps I can have a serious conversation with Sarah tonight. He understood. Sooner or later, he would have to muster his will and ask her a direct question. Nick, as usual, returned home after 7 in the evening. The day at the department was tense. A flurry of questions, related cases, interrogations. But what was going on in his soul when he crossed the threshold of his own house was reminiscent of a completely different puzzle, unknown and terrible. His relationship with Sarah was falling apart at the seams, and he had neither evidence nor a clear plan on how to fix everything. He entered the living room and immediately heard unusual sounds, loud rock music flowing from the speakers. Nick didn't even immediately realize that it was being played at their house. Sarah used to listen to something light, from the pop charts or relaxing jazz in the evenings. Looking around, he noticed that most of the furniture in the living room had been moved. Instead of the usual arranged chairs and armchairs, there was free space, and 2 boxes stood against the wall, looking like packaging of new lamps. "Sarah?" he called. "Here," her voice came from the kitchen. Nick walked there and saw a strange picture. His wife, usually elegant in suits or office clothes, was now wearing black jeans, a cropped t-shirt with some bright print, and provocatively combed hair. On the lips there is dark lipstick. She barely glanced at him as she continued to throw something into the trash can. "What's happening?" he asked carefully, looking at the house turned upside down. Sarah straightened up and turned to face him. He caught something bold in her gaze that he had not noticed before. "I decided it was too boring here. I want to change things up a little." Nick felt a wave of anxiety rise within him. The word boring sounded like a blow to his pride, but he tried to control himself. "Maybe you should have warned me," he remarked softly. "I would help with the furniture." Sarah shrugged. "I managed it myself, and now I can't wait for your help all the time. You disappear at work for days." Nick swallowed the lump in his throat. He was ready to object. "It's my job to protect, to seek the truth, to fulfill the duty that feeds us." But, seeing her cold gaze, I realized that it was useless to start an argument now. He looked at her clothes again. "New style?" "Yes," Sarah answered briefly. "I wanted something different. Tired of the monotony." There was irritation in the voice, and perhaps hidden mockery. The next day, when Nick returned from a morning meeting, he had an unexpected 2-hour window in his schedule and decided to pop home to pick up a forgotten charger. He saw someone else's motorcycle in the yard, a black Harley with bright stickers. Not typical transport for their quiet suburb. The neighbors seemed to have also noticed. There was almost no one on the street, but the sash of the neighboring window was slightly opened, and someone's curious eyes looked out. Nick drove up slowly and parked his SUV nearby. The motorcycle engine was turned off, which means the owner is somewhere inside the house or nearby. Walking into the living room, he found Sarah there, chatting animatedly with some man tall, with tattoos on his arms, wearing a leather biker jacket. He had a mug in his hands. Apparently Sarah gave him coffee. He laughed loudly, easily, as if he felt at home here. "Oh, Nick," she said dryly when she saw her husband. "Hello." "Hi," Nick replied, automatically glancing at the biker. "Guest?" The man took a step forward and extended his hand. "Jason. And you, as I understand it, Nick. Nice to meet you." Nick shook his hand. Firm handshake, confident smile. Some kind of magnetic charisma emanated from Jason. Nick noted to himself, a typical alpha male, a man who, without hesitation, enters someone else's house and feels like a master. "Yes, I'm Nick, FBI agent," he added, and was surprised why he mentioned the service. Maybe he was trying to emphasize his seriousness in this way. "Whoa, FBI, cool," Jason responded with a shadow of a smile and looked at Sarah. "You didn't warn me that your husband was a federal man." Sarah smiled at him, and Nick saw a sparkle in her eyes that he hadn't seen in a long time when she looked at him. "Well, it happens," she shrugged, as if it wasn't a big deal. Not wanting to make a scene, Nick tried to speak calmly. "So what are you doing here?" "Yes," Sarah waved it off. "Jason. He's our new partner on the project. We have a startup, as I told you. We are looking for investors, doing promotion in general. Everything is complicated. So we decided to discuss some issues in an informal setting." "Got it," Nick said, trying to sound neutral. "For how long?" No, Jason interrupted. "I'm already leaving. Just dropped by to clarify a couple of details." He put the mug on the table, clapped Nick on the shoulder again in a friendly gesture, and moved towards the exit. Sarah went to accompany him. Nick heard her say quietly on the porch, "Okay, then I'll see you one of these days, okay? Stay in touch." "Of course, lady," Jason replied, a smile in his voice. The roar of an engine was heard, and a few seconds later Jason sped off on his Harley. When Sarah returned, Nick asked, "New project partner? Since when has your healthcare startup partnered with bikers?" Sarah sighed, as if holding back her irritation. "Some stereotypes. Jason has connections to several private funds and helps find the right people to invest in. Plus, he himself develops, so to speak, product strategies in various areas. We met at an event, and he suggested some interesting ideas." "That's it, enough interrogation. My brain is already exploding." Nick saw that she was tired, but he also felt something else, a certain inspiration, the energy that she received from communicating with Jason. He did not continue the conversation, although jealousy was bubbling inside him. But so far, no clear evidence. He could only guess how far their relationship had gone. Another day passed, and in the evening Sarah returned home around 10. She was wearing the same new leather jacket, and her hair seemed to have become a little brighter, as if she had tinted it with some shade. Nick sat in the living room and looked at the report on the case of forged documents, but his head was occupied with something else. "Hello," he said as she came into view. "Dinner is in the kitchen. You can heat it up." "Thank you," she replied, passing by. Then suddenly she stopped. "You know, maybe we need to have a serious conversation." Nick straightened up. "It's high time." "I think so too. I want to understand what is happening." She stood opposite, crossing her arms over her chest. "Listen, Nick, I don't know what's wrong with me. I just feel like I'm cramped, I'm suffocating. Maybe I've changed too much, maybe you." She was silent for a moment, then blurted out, "You've become boring. Seriously. I remember what you were like when we first moved here. You were burning with this work. You had 100 ideas. You were alive. And now I see how you have fallen into a routine. Everything is so predictable." Nick felt how cold everything inside was. It wasn't the reproach itself that hurt the most, but the ease with which she said it. "Boring?" he asked, barely restraining the trembling in his voice. "Maybe this is just a normal adult life, where there are responsibilities and not daily parties and madness." "You say so yourself," Sarah objected, shaking her head wearily. "Normal adult life. Yes, that's probably true, but I want something different. I'm not old yet. I want to feel alive. And I can no longer remain silent about this. And that's why you're hanging out with Jason. Her eyes flashed. Leave him alone. He just inspires me, helps me look at the world more broadly. Maybe you should communicate with someone other than your gray bureau colleagues. Nick sighed, feeling anger rising in his throat, but he knew that shouting would achieve nothing, and he was not ready for such a conversation. Okay, he answered quietly. I heard you. If you think I've become boring, okay? But what next? Sarah looked at him silently, as if she didn't know what to say, and only squeezed out. And then, I don't want to discuss this now. I need to take a shower. She went upstairs, leaving behind an incomprehensible feeling, as if she had announced to him that it was all over, but had not yet decided how exactly to formalize it. Nick fell into a chair, ran his hands over his face, and closed his eyes, repeating to himself, boring, boring. It seemed to him that before this word did not even exist in their vocabulary. Every week Sarah changed more and more. I threw the business suit, which I once considered my work armor, into the closet and put on a jacket or jeans that emphasized my figure. It was as if she lived a double life. During the day, she seemed to still be an employee of a serious startup, and in the evenings, she was an adventure seeker who went to concerts and met with some friends. And more often in telephone conversations, she mentioned Jason, sometimes forgetting that Nick was nearby and could hear. Nick tried to carefully find out what was going on, but every time he ran into irritation or short excuses. It's for work. I'm helping him with the documents. You got it all wrong. But one evening he had to understand everything and even more than he wanted. This happened on Friday when Nick stayed late at work. He needed to drive to a neighboring area to meet with an informant on official business. After leaving the building, he decided to buy some takeout and call Sarah, but she didn't pick up the phone. Again, probably somewhere with Jason, a bitter thought slipped through my head. On the way, he stopped in a parking lot near a large supermarket. It was already dark, but the lanterns illuminated a fairly spacious parking lot. Nick stopped the car at the shopping center to pick up some groceries for the weekend, and then, walking between the rows of cars, he noticed Sarah's familiar black jacket and blonde hair. It can't be, he thought at first, but he stepped closer, hiding behind a nearby car. Sarah stood next to that same black Harley. Jason was with her, leaning against the seat. They talked, and Sarah laughed, somehow easily, naturally. Nick heard fragments of phrases. You're so crazy, always for you, baby. And then Jason pulled Sarah towards him and kissed her. Not friendly, not fleetingly, but in such a way that there was no doubt about their relationship. And Sarah answered him by hugging his neck. Nick felt his insides shrink. He couldn't bring himself to move away or come closer. He just stood there, staring into space as his wife and another man kissed in the parking lot like it was the most natural thing in the world. Sarah said something, laughing, and Jason answered her, after which they both got on the motorcycle and drove off, driving out onto the road. Nick's gaze followed them, the helmet on Jason's head, Sarah's flowing hair. They drove away towards the night lights, plunging into the atmosphere of adventure, and he into a silent nightmare. He stood for several minutes, trying to comprehend what he had seen. What he had only guessed about received visible confirmation. Sarah was not just inspired by this charismatic biker. It seems that a real romance broke out between them. At the sight of their kiss, Nick felt a sharp pain of betrayal. Anger, shame, resentment, everything was mixed inside. But what next? In police or agent business, he knew how to act when evidence was discovered. But here, faced with betrayal, he only felt that he was losing his footing. He wanted to break out and catch up with them, causing a scandal, but he suppressed this outburst. Instead, Nick simply walked towards his car in a daze. He didn't remember how he got home and didn't feel hungry, although he planned to take dinner out. The question was beating inside. Should I tell Sarah that I know everything? He couldn't answer yet. It seemed to him that if he asked a direct question now, he would receive direct confirmation, and this would only make things worse. But it is also impossible to remain silent. Nick woke up that day with the feeling that an abyss had grown next to him overnight. He didn't find Sarah in bed. She left earlier again, without even telling him where. Lately, such departures have become almost the norm, but each time they hit my soul. He lay there for a long time, looking at the ceiling, replaying the scene in the parking lot in his head, and trying to figure out how to proceed. At the mere thought of Jason, everything inside was clenched with resentment, but Nick taught himself to exercise self-control. Emotions rarely served him well, especially when clarity was needed. However, he understood. The moment of truth was near. During these days, he never decided to have a direct conversation, and Sarah seemed to be waiting for him to explode, or, conversely, give up. He had to take the step he'd been putting off, revealing the truth he already knew and seeing if their marriage could survive the turmoil. Or has it been destroyed for a long time, and they just continue to stick to their usual roles? Nick arrived at work earlier than usual. I tried to switch to business. A sea of information on 2 investigations had accumulated in my folders and computer. My colleagues asked for help with building chains of electronic transfers. However, thoughts about Sarah did not let go. Delays, a kiss with Jason, a sharp change in style. She directly said that he had become boring, and more often she found herself in the company of a new friend. "Hey Nick, is everything okay?" Harris called out to him, looking into the office. "Yes," Nick answered, trying to sound indifferent. "I'm just tired." "Listen, this is a case of false documents. I'll email you everything you need by lunchtime," Nick interrupted. "Frets. If anything happens, I'll be there." Harris waved his hand and left. When Harris disappeared, Nick closed the folder, leaned on the back of the chair, and closed his eyes. He knew that this couldn't go on for long. Life seemed to be going along 2 roads. In one calm, measured work, in the other a falling-apart marriage, seasoned with acute emotions that did not want to find a way out. By lunchtime, he had a minute's break, and Nick decided to call Sarah. A long beep, then another, and finally her voice. "Yes," she said indifferently. "Sarah, it's me. We need to talk. Tonight." "For what?" There was a cold surprise in her voice. "I think you understand why." "Okay," she snapped after a short pause. "I'll be home at 7, if I don't leave earlier." Nick answered with a dull, "Thank you," and ended the conversation. If she didn't show up, he was ready to find her himself or wait at the startup's office. But I hoped that she would still have the courage to come and talk like a human being. The rest of the day dragged on painfully. Nick tried to finish the report, but the lines blurred before his eyes. Finally, around 6 in the evening, he gathered his strength and went home. When he turned on the engine, it was as if a switch had clicked inside. He already knew that there would be no half measures, no attempts to turn a blind eye to the obvious. That's it, the conversation will take place. There was a wary silence in the house. Sarah, unlike usual, arrived earlier and was sitting in the living room. On the table in front of her was an open magazine and a glass of red wine. She is wearing black leggings, a short t-shirt, and a voluminous jacket with stripes, which she clearly once took from Jason or bought to suit his style. A light aroma of new eau de toilette emanated from her, harsh and teasing. "Hello," Nick said, lowering the case with documents to the floor. "Hi," Sarah looked up. A mixture of tension and annoyance was visible in her eyes. It was as if she had come here not as a wife, but as a rival in the ring, waiting to be hit. He sat down on the sofa opposite. "Thank you for being home. I wanted to talk. More precisely, we need to do this." She was silent, looking at him defiantly, and sipped her wine. "I won't beat around the bush," Nick said after a pause. "I know about you and Jason. I saw you." "Where did you see it?" She leaned forward. "There, by the parking lot, where the supermarket is." "When you were kissing," Nick sighed heavily. "I happened to be nearby, and I saw everything." Sarah was silent for a while, then took a sip of wine and chuckled. "Fine. Now everything is clear. That's why you walked around me with that look." Nick pulled himself together so as not to raise his voice. "I didn't want to start with interrogations. I was waiting for you to admit it yourself." Sarah laughed short and bitterly. "Confess what? Is it that I feel bad in our marriage? That I'm tired of silence and dullness? Because you never take risks, don't offer anything, and always follow the plan and schedule. Yes, sorry, maybe I should have said earlier, but I'm afraid it wouldn't change anything. She put the glass on the table, sighed furiously, and Nick saw that she was actually in pain and worried. She was just trying to hide it behind ostentatious insolence. Does he give you something that I don't? Nick asked quietly. Jason. Cool motorcycles, extreme sports, dubious companies. Are you sure this is worth destroying our family? Sarah looked at him with a look full of melancholy and despair, mixed with a strange determination. It's just the adrenaline there, Nick. I feel alive. Do you remember when we met? You were a cop, you had cases, chases. You were passionate about work, you took risks, you could return home with sparkling eyes, telling how you managed to detain a dealer or find evidence in a complex case. I remember, Nick nodded, feeling bitterness in his chest. And now, she grinned. You're in the bureau, but your life is all paperwork and digital investigations. You are probably doing something important, I don't argue, but there is no fire. Understand? No passion. Nick tried to swallow a lump of resentment. Forgive me for not getting into trouble, because my job is to serve the law, to think with my head, and not to rush into dubious adventures. Sorry for being boring. But Sarah, believe me, I have always tried to give you confidence in the future. I never wanted you to worry about tomorrow, and you knew that I wouldn't leave, I wouldn't cheat, I wouldn't betray. Yes, but that doesn't mean I don't need something else. Her voice broke into a sharp intonation. I'm tired of your vaunted calmness. It's like I'm bubbling inside, but you don't notice it. So you were looking for a way to shake things up, Nick asked, and found him in the form of Jason. Sarah lowered her head and answered quietly. Yes, and I'm not bored with him. I feel needed. He's so alive, real, and he doesn't go into his own world, you know? Nick closed his eyes for a moment, trying to control himself. Everything hurts, both pride and heart. He couldn't play the strings Jason played, but he loved Sarah for so many years, thought about her, took care of her. The question was, does this mean anything now? And what next? He asked finally. You understand that this cannot continue. Either we are trying to fix everything, or... She looked at him with an unblinking gaze. I'm leaving, Nick. The silence in the living room became unbearable. Nick thought he had misheard. Are you leaving? Where? To him? Maybe to him. There was a slight hesitation in her voice, then, as if gathering strength, she added, or I'll rent a place for myself until I figure it out. But I'm definitely leaving this house. Sarah. Nick clenched his hands into fists to keep from screaming. Do you understand what you are saying? She nodded, and tears sparkled in her eyes, although she tried hard to look strong. Understood. I made a decision. You and I spoke, but it was as if we were speaking different languages. I'm sorry, but I don't see that we can go back to the way things were. Everything could have been different, Nick said bitterly. I could just come and say what doesn't suit you and not lead me to betrayal. Do you think I didn't try? She snapped. How could I, if you are always immersed in your work, and when you come back, you act like you don't want to hear about my problems? When I started talking about how I was bored, you brushed it off. Okay, rest, everything will be fine. But it wasn't good. Nick was taken aback for a moment, not finding what to answer. There was some truth in her words, although he did not see indifference in himself. Perhaps he simply did not understand her inner breakdown. And now this is the end, right? He muttered through his teeth. It's over, Nick, she confirmed more quietly. They looked at each other in silence. Nick felt like everything he loved and protected was crumbling right now, at this moment. Well, he stood up, trying to maintain the remnants of his composure. If you have made a choice, then I will not hold you back by force. But remember, Sarah, bad guys are not heroes. They're just bad. Your Jason may seem like a romantic, but in reality he is just a man who lives one day at a time, regardless of the consequences. She laughed bitterly. Thanks for the warning, FBI agent. You were probably taught to consider everyone a suspect, right? Let me guess, Have you already checked his dossier, or are you just about to? Nick frowned, but answered firmly. No, I don't meddle in your private life, and I respect the law. But you will also understand that in the real world, everything is not as simple as in the picture with motorcycles and tattoos. Sarah ran her hand through her hair and looked away. Maybe I'll understand, maybe I won't. But I can't live in your safe world anymore. I need something different. Perhaps I'm wrong, but it's my choice, Nick. He looked at her again. He wanted to say out loud, "Don't go, we'll fix everything," but something inside him already understood that the moment had been missed. She won't come back. Or if he returns, it won't be soon, having gone through his own trials. Okay, he squeezed out, hiding the pain behind an even tone. Do as you decide. I won't bother you. Sarah took a step towards the doors. On the way, I grabbed a pre-prepared backpack and a light sports bag in the hallway. Apparently, I collected the most necessary things. I'm going to see a friend, she said shortly. Then I'll probably figure out where to stay for a long time. She turned around on the threshold. Her gaze softened. You know, Nick, I didn't want it to turn out like this. But sometimes people change. I hope you'll be happy. Is it true? And forgive me if you can. I will always love you, he said almost in a whisper. Or at least the Sarah you used to be. I don't understand what kind of person this is in front of me now, but I remember what you were like. I'm sorry I couldn't give you what you were looking for. She pursed her lips as if about to say something, but she just nodded and walked out into the dark night. The door closed behind her without knocking softly but completely. Nick didn't move, looking at the closed door. For a while he heard footsteps on the porch, and then the light knock of a car closing. The roar of an engine or the sound of a car driving away, he didn't know for sure, but it was clear she was gone. The house was empty in an instant, as if all the warmth and light had been taken away by Sarah, slamming the door behind her. Nick went into the living room, took a glass from the sideboard, and poured himself some whiskey, although he was not a drinker. Sitting down on the edge of the sofa, he felt the stress of the last days breaking him from the inside. He wanted to break the glass and scream, but out of habit he held back. Compressed emotions throbbed in his temples, and there was a cold emptiness in his chest, reminding him that he was now alone. He remembered how they once watched movies together in the evenings on that same couch, holding hands. How we planned trips together, dreamed of children, although we never decided to have them, thinking that there was still a lot of time ahead. Now all these memories turned into pain. Sarah went to a new adrenaline, throwing a reproach in her face. You have become boring. But despite the insult, Nick felt an underlying pity for Sarah. He knew that bad boys often bring much more trouble than romantics, and if Jason is really involved in something dangerous, Sarah could get caught up in a story, the way out of which will be much harder than a simple divorce. But she did not listen to the warnings. The empty look at the wall lasted endlessly. He understood. Ahead were papers about divorce, division of property, pain, perhaps conversations with relatives. But now, at this moment, it all seemed like a distant echo. The main thing has already happened. Sarah made her choice. Slowly, Nick put the glass on the table and ran his hand over his face. He knew that in the morning he would have to get up and go to work, meet with colleagues, and immerse himself in business. Life will not stop, although inside it is as if the foundation has collapsed. He was an FBI agent, a man who was used to overcoming difficulties, but his wife's betrayal turned out to be a much more painful experience than any crime drama. In complete silence, the evening turned into night. Nick sat down at the table, opened a folder with unfinished documents on the case, and realized that he was not able to read anything right now. With his mind, he understood that this would not always be the case, that the pain would subside and a new stage would begin. But my soul didn't let go yet. He wanted to scream, sob, run after her, and beg to stay, but pride and awareness of the futility of this constrained him. He was once a police officer and learned to accept losses and sacrifices during arrests. But it was in the service, everything there was subject to a clear meaning. And now there was no meaning, No order, only the feeling that life had been turned upside down forever with one short phrase: "I'm leaving, Nick." Sitting down in silence on the floor, he rested his forehead on his knees and closed his eyes. And only the beat of his heart and the distant sounds of the night city accompanied this moment. Thus ended the story of their marriage inevitably and coldly. It is still unknown how events will develop further, but one thing is clear: they will no longer be the same. Sarah chose the adrenaline path, laughing in the face of his attempts to warn her against making a mistake. "Bad guys are not heroes, Sarah." His words echoed in his memory, and now Nick could only hope that one day she would realize how bitterly right he was. However, by then he may no longer be waiting for her return. He knew that he had to move on with his life, no matter how hard it was. But neither work, nor whiskey, nor a short night can fill this emptiness in the heart. Only scars will remain, which perhaps will teach him something new about life, about love, and that even the calmest and most faithful person cannot restrain someone who wants to break into madness. Exactly a year has passed since Sarah left Nick, slamming the door in their common home, where they were once happy. Much has changed since then, although, at first glance, everything in Nick's life looked calm and ordinary. He remained an FBI agent, continued to work on investigations, helped his colleagues, and was successful enough to receive a couple of small promotions per year. But those who knew him better noticed a constant wariness and gloomy glow in Nick's eyes, as if he was trying to keep the world at arm's length. On the day he was to hear the news about Sarah, he woke up a little earlier than usual. Over the course of this year, Nick has gotten used to living alone. The house seemed spacious and cold. He never removed some of the things that belonged to Sarah. They lay hidden in boxes in the attic. Sometimes, looking at the dusty boxes, Nick asked himself why he didn't throw away everything that reminded him of his ex-wife. Perhaps there was still a faint spark of the past smoldering inside him, or perhaps his bitter stubbornness did not give him the right to get rid of the memories. After having a simple breakfast of cereal, he briefly said hello to himself, checked his email on his smartphone, and went to the office. The weather was cloudy, light rain had been falling since the morning. Previously, Sarah often complained, "How I hate this dullness." Now Nick caught himself thinking that he no longer cared whether it was rain or sun. He was simply accustomed to any circumstances, since nothing could hurt him as much as last year's disaster in his personal life. The FBI office was located in the same beige building. Nick entered, as usual, presenting his identification at the entrance, walked along the corridor past the security posts, and found himself in his office. Even rows of tables, several employees at computers. Someone smiled at him, someone nodded. Once upon a time, he himself approached people with greater openness, but now he preferred to keep his distance. He managed to sit down at the table and open his laptop when there was a knock on the door, and Harris appeared on the threshold, the same colleague who had once noticed that Nick was tired or preoccupied with something. "Do you have a couple of minutes?" asked Harris. "Yes, sure. Come in." Harris entered, closed the door behind him, and threw a folder with a neat label on the table. In the upper left corner was the mark on the Division of Controlled Substances and the Federal Bureau of Investigation in a joint case. Nick raised his eyebrows. "What's there?" "New business," Harris sighed. "More precisely, it is old for us, but several new detainees have appeared, and additional defendants may emerge. In general, we are talking about a network that operated between this state and the neighboring one. You've probably heard about the Riverheads gang. They've been pumping light and heavy illegal substances across our borders for a couple of years, forging documents, and are generally good in every sense." Nick nodded. Riverheads had been on several news reports. He flipped through the folder. Several familiar names, those who had already been detained before. Some of them made a deal with the investigation, some were still wanted. But Harris looked at Nick with a strange caution as he read the documents. "What's new there?" Nick asked, turning the page. "This." Harris reached over and turned over several sheets of paper until he pointed his finger at one of the photographic applications. "Among the new detainees during the raid is yours." He didn't have time to finish because Nick was already looking at the photo himself. Sarah was in the photo. exhausted, pale, wearing a black t-shirt and her hands behind her back, obviously in handcuffs. There are traces of fatigue on her face, and it is clear from her eyes that she either did not sleep or was crying, but it was definitely her, the woman who a year ago screamed in his face that she was leaving for her new life. To the adrenaline. "Sarah," he said almost in a whisper. Harris pursed his lips. "I thought you'd better know before someone else brings this case." Sorry to have to deliver such news. Something inside Nick clenched into a tight knot. He knew what could happen. I knew that problems always follow the bad guys. But still, facing this reality turned out to be painful. "When was she detained?" he asked. "2 days ago, on the border of a neighboring state, along with a group of carriers. They allegedly distilled a batch of, well, in general, there were several types of prohibited substances. There's a whole minibus of suspects. It looks like Riverheads were using them as a folding network of couriers. And she—" Harris hesitated, not knowing how to express himself more tactfully. "Was Sarah there with her boyfriend?" Nick said, not believing that he was saying these words. "He is wanted. He was not at the place of detention, but we assume that he is one of the leaders, or at least promoters, of the network." "Jason," Nick said quietly. "Apparently, yes. We are checking connections. She has not yet confessed, but she is not resisting much either. From her condition, it is clear that their life was fun. Perhaps she participated voluntarily, or perhaps she was dragged into it. Your leadership wants us to carefully interrogate anyone who can provide a lead to Jason. He's a big fish now." Nick listened silently. His heart was pounding, but over the years he learned to show external calm. He remembered his words before Sarah left. Bad guys aren't heroes. They're just bad. It turned out that everything was really like that. Not some kind of romance of freedom and motorcycles, but a banal criminal swamp. "I'll get down to business," Nick said evenly. "I'll have to leave the office. We need to agree on how I can participate in the interrogation." "I know. They're officially afraid to put you on the list because well, you have a conflict of interest, but it is also not very convenient to distract someone from the outside, since you are already aware. I understand the risks." Nick clenched his fingers. "Interrogation is part of the procedure. Perhaps her testimony could lead to Jason, and I will be able to keep a cool head." Harris looked at Nick searchingly, but saw the usual firmness in his gaze. Over the past year, Nick had learned to control his feelings, and now he seemed calm, even though there were probably storms raging inside. "Okay," Harris nodded. "The authorities are already aware. I warned that we have such a special witness. They were waiting for you downstairs as soon as you looked at the folder," he concluded. "Maybe you want a little time to come to your senses." Nick closed the folder. "No, I'm ready. Let's go." Nick was an infrequent visitor to the prison, where people under investigation for major federal cases were held. He usually worked with documents, analysis, and sometimes went on operations, but he was not a pro in prison interrogations. There were investigators and operatives for that. However, this time management decided that Nick could ask Sarah clarifying questions, given that he knew the whole story with Jason. Plus, it was logical that when she saw a familiar face, she might open up more than she would to unfamiliar agents. They agreed to conduct the interrogation behind closed doors, but on the record. Nick understood in advance that it would be difficult. By law, he was obliged to comply with all formalities. Sarah was led into the office, a dusty small room with a table and 2 chairs, a lamp under the ceiling. Nick was already sitting there, crossing his arms over his chest, trying to contain his excitement. He heard the door creak, and 2 guards entered the room, escorting Sarah. She was in a regular prison uniform, grayish-green. Her hair was casually tied into a ponytail, and there were bluish shadows under her eyes on her face. Slim, haggard, with angular movements. But at the same time, she is still beautiful, if you look closely. Those features that he loved have not gone away. They just faded. Sarah saw Nick, and a whole mixture of feelings flashed in her gaze. Shock, shame, some kind of bitter relief that it was him. Then she quickly looked away, as if she couldn't stand his gaze. The guard motioned her to a chair. "Take a seat. You can leave your hands on the table. Don't you dare freak out." Sarah sat down, and the guards, without asking questions, stood for a few more seconds, and, having received a sign from Nick, left, leaving the door ajar. One of the employees stood behind the door, formally controlling the situation, but out of Sarah's line of sight. A special camera in the upper corner of the room recorded everything that happened for the case. There was a heavy silence. Nick saw Sarah twitch slightly. She nervously fingered the edge of her prison uniform. "Hello," he said quietly. She bit her lip without answering right away. Then she exhaled. "Hello, Nick." The voice sounded brittle and tired. Compared to the Sarah who, a year ago, had thrown mocking reproaches in his face, she seemed to have turned into a shadow of herself. "Do you have a lawyer?" he asked, observing formalities. "Do you want his presence?" Sarah shook her head. "Not yet. They told me that they would send me from the state if I didn't find it myself. You know, I can't afford any paid protection. Basically, I don't have any money." Nick saw bitter humility in her eyes. They both understood that financially she was in a complete dead end. "Okay, then let's confirm on camera that you yourself agree to talk with me, realizing that I am a representative of the FBI and all information can be used by the investigation." He leaned forward a little. "Understand?" "Yes," she nodded. "I understand. I have nothing to hide, Nick." Sarah said this with sad irony. He turned on the recorder and looked around. There was a video recording. He spoke a formula about who he is, who she is, under what conditions the conversation is taking place, and recorded her agreement. Everything is according to procedure. Once the formalities were completed, he switched to a quieter, more human tone. "Tell me what happened. How did you end up among those detained while transporting prohibited substances?" Sarah silently ran her hand through her hair and sighed heavily. At first I lived with Jason. It was fun, we rode a motorcycle, he showed me all sorts of cool places, and we hung out. I thought I was finally living life to the fullest. And for a while it seemed to me that we were, well, perfect for each other. He knew a lot of people, bikers, some investors, strange types. I didn't ask too much. And then, she smiled bitterly, I began to notice that there were a lot of illegal activities around him. At first these were informal transactions, then more and more. He deceived me. He said that this was just his own business. But I was stupid. I believed in his words about quick money and adrenaline. Yes, there was enough adrenaline, but it was different. The fear of getting into trouble. Nick listened, trying not to show his emotions, although inside, pity and anger flared up alternately. But he knew. Now he is not just an ex-husband, he is a representative of a federal agency. I realized that he was connected with prohibited substances when a batch of some capsules suddenly appeared at our house, Sarah continued. He said, "Help me sort. These are vitamins for the sports community." And I believed it at first. But then I saw that these were not vitamins. She started making trouble, asking, "Are you carrying prohibited substances?" He fought back with jokes, saying that everything was under control, and in general these were unclean drugs that he himself did not use. But soon people appeared who threatened me. They said that if I start asking too many questions, I will disappear. "And you still didn't leave?" Sarah smiled bitterly. "I tried. But where? I left my house, I left my job when we started wandering around different cities. Then, when I realized that I was in trouble, it was too late. He kept me as a trophy or I don't know, he always inspired me that there was no other way for me, and it seemed to me." She paused, tears welling up in her eyes. "It seemed like I couldn't return to you, to our old world. I destroyed everything myself, but I was afraid to live alone. I had no money, I didn't know where to sleep, so I stayed like that." "Tell me about the transport in which you were captured," Nick reminded, so that the conversation did not go into purely personal revelations. Sarah wiped tears from her eyelashes. "Jason said it would just be an out-of-state trip, to pick up boxes from the warehouse and bring them here. I already knew what was in the boxes, but if I refused, he would. She whispered, squeezing her hands. He knows how to scare me. He and the people with him. I couldn't escape. I didn't even have a proper telephone. He took everything from me except one cheap handset, through which I could only call him. And so we left in a convoy of 2 or 3 cars. Jason was riding his bike in front, but an hour later he disappeared somewhere and said that we would meet at the gas station. I hoped that at least with him next to me, I felt some kind of protection, although it sounds funny. But he disappeared, and after some time we were surrounded by agents. She covered her face with her palms. That's all. Now I'm here. And he left again. I don't know anything. Maybe he left for someone else. Maybe he just slipped away. Maybe he was on the run. I only heard that these people, riverheads, are dangerous. If someone speaks, they can deal. Nick listened, barely moving. He felt resentment pounding somewhere in his chest. This is what her thirst for adventure led to. But at the same time, it spoke with professional clarity. Her information could really help detain Jason. And it seems she found herself deeper in this story than she could have imagined. "What do you know about the immediate structure of riverheads?" he asked. "I don't understand," Sarah shook her head. "I know that Jason had his people. He often talked about Blake, something like senior partner. I heard other names. Carlos, Trey, maybe these are nicknames. They have their own hierarchy. At first I thought that they were just a gang of bikers, but it turned out that it was a whole network with supplies. I saw different types of prohibited substances, from amphetamine to heavy opiates. I was kept in the dark so that I didn't know much." She spoke heatedly, sometimes confusedly, clearly looking for excuses. Nick was clear. She really was not the main figure. But her involvement shouldn't be ruled out either. Perhaps the prosecutor's office will charge her with complicity. "Sarah," he finally said, "you have a choice: to cooperate, to testify, to provide any details about contacts, storage locations, people you saw. Then the investigation may apply for a mitigation of the sentence. If you remain silent, you risk getting a prison term, and a long one. You understand?" She looked up. "Understand. But you know they can take revenge. Riverheads will not forgive betrayal." For the first time during the entire interrogation, Nick softened his tone a little. "Yes, but in the witness protection program, you have a chance if you give enough valuable information to help apprehend the big players. You can be relocated, given a different identity. You can start a new life somewhere else." Sarah listened with her shoulders slumped. New life. Sounds like a dream. She smiled wryly. "And if I refuse then, that's no life either. They'll lock me up here, and there's no guarantee that even in prison they won't get to me." There was silence for a minute. Nick understood. From a legal point of view, he could not promise her mountains of gold. But as a man who had once been her husband, he felt the urge to help. Despite everything, he saw her condition. All the bravado had disappeared somewhere. All that remained was a frightened woman stuck in a serious crime. "Sarah," he said finally, "think about it, and decide quickly. The sooner you start talking, the better your chances." She ran her hand over her cheeks and wiped away tears. "I will testify. Everything I remember. I have nothing left to lose, Nick." He nodded, trying to maintain professional detachment. Then he turned off the recorder, recording the end time, leaned forward. "Tomorrow people from the prosecutor's office, from the Department for Prohibited Substances, will come here. I probably will too. We will officially conduct the interrogation with a recording and questions from the prosecutor. You can give names, addresses, give any evidence. So, Sarah, your real chance of easing your sentence is to tell the truth and not hold back any details." She nodded silently, having difficulty controlling her sobs. "You see, I can't hush it all up," Nick continued. "I can't just drag you out of here. It doesn't work that way. But if you cooperate with the investigation, you can count on a deal. Then, if you're afraid for your life, we'll look into the witness protection program." "Thank you," she whispered, looking down. "I know I was a fool when I left you. All this, I didn't think it would end like this. Sorry." She interrupted herself, as if realizing that it was too late for an apology. "Time will tell," Nick answered evenly. "The main thing is for you to understand. You have no room to maneuver. And God forbid you lie or try to shield Jason, cover for someone from Riverheads, keep in mind. This will only complicate your situation." Sarah nodded, covering her face with her hands. "I'll tell you everything, Nick." The voice trembled. "I'm sorry." He stood up, trying not to look her straight in the eye. Feelings were pounding loudly in my chest. Pain, pity, anger, all at once. But he could not give them away out. Too much was at stake. As an FBI agent, he has to be a professional. And as a person, perhaps he was too burned to allow himself to feel again. Carefully opening the door, he nodded to the guards. "Take me away." She agreed to cooperate. "Get your papers ready." The two guards entered again. Sarah stood up, not taking her eyes off Nick. Her eyes were shining with tears. A silent plea was read on her lips. "Forgive me. Help." But Nick couldn't reciprocate now. He just nodded at her coldly, expressing something between support and farewell. As Sarah was let out, the door closed behind her softly, like a mark on their past. Nick was left alone in the room and looked at the camera in the corner. It was still recording. Sighing, he went to the switch and interrupted the video recording. The interrogation procedure is over. Now he has to write an official report, which should not contain any personal details, only facts and conclusions that will help the case. On this day, Nick arrived at the prison without the usual severity in his gait, but with the same concentration in his eyes as always. At the checkpoint, he showed his ID, signed the register, and walked along the familiar corridor to the visiting room. Ribbon-dividing strips began from this place. The sound of footsteps echoed loudly from the concrete walls. The smell of disinfectant and faded paint on the walls made the corridor even more impersonal. He was shown a booth with thick glass, a special room where the defendants could see the visitor only through a transparent partition and communicate through a fixed speaking tube or a grated metal hole. Nick was led to one of these windows. Sarah was already sitting behind the glass on a metal chair, slouching as if trying to make herself smaller. At the sight of Nick, she raised her head, and the expression in her eyes flickered between hope and despair. There was nervousness in the way she clenched and unclenched her fingers in her lap. Before Nick could sit down, she said quietly, "Thank you for coming." But Nick simply nodded, taking a seat opposite. For now, they were separated by glass and the shadow of a grating running down the middle. Sarah was only allowed to remove her handcuffs in the visiting room, so she could raise her hand as if she wanted to touch the glass, but stopped at the last moment. "They told me that I have a visit." "I thought it would be a lawyer," she said hoarsely, barely moving her lips. "But when I saw you..." She swallowed, and tears rolled down her cheeks. I don't know if I'm happy or even more afraid." Nick listened silently. On the surface, he seemed calm, but in fact, a wave of memories rose inside his soul. Everything that once connected him with Sarah, all the joyful moments, all the grievances and pain of the past year. "Nick," she began again, leaning closer to the glass. "I'm sorry. I wanted to tell you everything so many times, but I didn't dare. I know I have no excuse. It's just..." She bit her lip, trying to get away from the tone of a life-tested woman and move on to human conversation. "I didn't know he would take me so deep. At first it was fun, adventurous, and then it was like being trapped. I couldn't break free." She spoke almost in a whisper, while her eyes constantly repeated the same silent plea, "Save me." Nick squeezed the receiver of the intercom. It was screwed to the wall on his side, so in order to speak, he had to bring it to his lips. He looked at Sarah through the thick glass. He involuntarily recalled how he had once seen her at the kitchen table in an old dressing gown, laughing at some stupid joke. Then she was full of strength and life. Now her face is haggard, her lips are chapped, her eyes are dull. She seemed to realize where her desire for freedom and adrenaline had taken her. "Help me, Nick." He heard through the slight interference of the speaker. "Please, I don't know what will happen next. I'm scared. You are an FBI agent. You have connections, opportunities. She began to sob, covering her face with her hand. Do something. Without you, I will be imprisoned for a long time, and Riverheads can. They are terrible people, you know it yourself. If I reveal everything I know, they will find me even in prison. Nick, don't you really feel sorry for me at all? Sarah pressed her forehead against the glass, sobbing quietly. It seemed that she had completely forgotten about the pride that sounded so loud a year ago when she left for the bad guy. Nick looked at her with an even, unblinking gaze. The past year has taught him that pity is not always the best advisor, and although inside he still felt bitterness from her confessions, now he was first and foremost a representative of the law. I warned you, Sarah. Bad guys are not heroes. They're just bad, he said quietly but clearly, and his voice contained everything. Resentment, pain, experience, the inescapable, I told you so. She straightened up with a jerk and looked at him as before, with a mixture of mistrust, hope, and despair. Nick continued. You already said everything during the interrogation. They'll give you witness protection if you really tell everything you remember. There is no point in lying. No one can protect you as much as you can when you agree to cooperate with the investigation. But you can do something, she whispered, swallowing tears. You're an agent, Nick. Yui. Yes, I'm an agent, and I work according to the protocol. My personal feelings don't matter. She covered her face with her hands, and then suddenly hit the glass with her palm. I'm scared. I don't understand anything. I live in hell. I don't know who to believe. It seems to me that if I reveal all my connections, one day Riverheads will get to me. I really didn't want this. I wasn't looking for crime. I just wanted a thrill. I thought that Jason and I would ride a motorcycle, go out of town, have fun. Nick didn't look away. But you knew he wasn't just a biker. You saw his friends, heard these conversations. There were signals. Sarah nodded bitterly. Yes, they were, but I realized too late. Then I was already dependent on him for everything. He intimidated me, blackmailed me, said that if I left, they would find me. Her voice broke, and she began to sob again. And at that moment, it suddenly dawned on him. Should he continue this conversation? Is there some kind of sadistic relish in her fall? But it was all useless. Sarah had really hit rock bottom, and he came here not to save her, but to make it clear. The only thing that will save her is maximum cooperation with the investigation. He stood up, looked away from her tears, returning the speaking tube to its hook. I did everything I could to give you a chance to at least make a deal. I explained to you your rights and options. My duty is done. At that second, Sarah managed to get up and pressed herself against the glass, as if hoping to catch his gaze. Nick, please, at least something, tell me that everything will be fine. Nick was already looking towards the door. He added quietly, Get over it, Sarah. Life doesn't give guarantees. Now it's all up to you. He turned and walked towards the exit, leaving her sitting behind the glass. She rushed to the glass, muffled, shouting, Nick! But he didn't turn around. A painful feeling came over her, similar to the memory of how she once left their house. Only this time the roles changed. Now he left her neither a hint of hope nor an outstretched hand. Sarah slowly sank into the cold metal bench, lost and broken, realizing that of all the past world, of all her freedom, there was nothing left. Yes, she has the opportunity to make deals with the investigation, but there is neither love nor the previous illusions. And Nick, her ex-husband, the same calm, reliable cop whom she once abandoned, has now left without so much as a word of sympathy. He crossed the long prison corridor, not noticing either the guards or the gloomy walls. Thoughts were swirling in his head, but outwardly Nick remained impeccably collected exactly as he had been taught all these years of service. Emotions are subordinate to reason. When he went outside, he felt a cool breeze. He looked up at the sky, gray clouds, gloomy, approaching each other. He caught his reflection in the glass door, a straight back, compressed lips, a shadow of pain in his eyes. I really warned you, Sarah. Flashed through my thoughts. But he knew that even if she realized her mistake, it would not change anything for either her or him. A year ago, she made a choice, and its echoes are still heard. Nick got into the car, closed the door, sat for a few seconds without turning on the ignition. Then he sighed, started the engine, and quietly drove out of the prison grounds, leaving Sarah in that cold and gray building, divided into countless surveillance areas and control points. The short meeting behind the glass came down to a confession, which he listened to, but he could no longer help, and he did not want to. For the clouds in the sky, as well as in the soul, threatened to drag on for a long time, and Sarah had to find the path to salvation on her own. So he left, clutching in his soul a steely determination not to return to the past again. Behind him was the woman he had once loved and to whom he had once said, "Bad guys aren't heroes, Sarah. They're just bad." She didn't believe it then. Now, perhaps, she believed it, but it was too late to change anything. In the evening, when the long corridor of the prison had already plunged into the usual twilight, Sarah was taken out of the interrogation room and led back to her cell. Black, heavy doors with a metallic clang locked behind her one after another, as if confirming there was no longer any return to her past life. In the tired eyes of the guard, one could read the indifference with which prisoners are usually treated. But all this weighed on Sarah with a leaden weight. She was not used to the monotonous rhythm of the prison routine, although she had already spent several weeks here. On the same day, she was called by a lawyer provided by the state. A short, middle-aged woman with a tuft of hair at the back of her head and a stern look through her glasses. She studied the papers with fateful signatures, leafed through the protocols, then, closing the folder, said in a quiet but confident voice, "Sarah, I will do everything possible within the law, but I must warn you, the deadline will be real. We may be able to reach a plea deal and reduce the charges to co-financing or assisting a criminal group, but given the volume of evidence, you will have to be punished. The minimum threshold can be lowered if you continue to cooperate, but without unnecessary illusions." Sarah sat opposite the lawyer, her hands clasped. This woman was essentially indifferent to her. For a lawyer, it is one of many cases, just another object of negotiations with the prosecutor. And yet this alien woman seemed a little more human than Sarah herself felt now. Sarah wanted to ask, what if I tell absolutely everything? If I help catch Jason? But she already understood. No matter where this path led her, it would not be easy. "So, the real deadline," she said hoarsely. "Yes," the lawyer nodded, adjusting her glasses. "How much exactly will depend on the amount of information that will help the court and investigation. But prepare yourself mentally. It won't be just a conditional one." Sarah nodded wordlessly. She had long suspected that this would be the case, but to hear it bluntly was a bitter confirmation of hopelessness. A year ago, when she left Nick's house, she was seething with a thirst for freedom and emotions. She talked about adrenaline and vibrant life. Now, every step of this brightness was followed by a long list of criminal articles, and it all ended here, behind gray walls. After a short conversation, the lawyer collected the papers and left. Sarah was left alone in the room. After a few minutes, the guard called her away, and she obediently followed him along the long corridor to the cell. The six-bed cell was filled with the usual prison smells of dampness and cheap detergent. The neighbors, also detained awaiting trial, each sat in their own corners, talking quietly or simply mindlessly looking at the walls. Sarah walked to her bed and sank onto the hard mattress. I thought about pouring myself some water, but I realized that my throat was already sore from tears, from tension. She remembered previous interrogations where she saw Nick. I remembered how I asked him for help, crying through the glass. As he answered her in a cold tone, "I warned you, Sarah. Bad guys aren't heroes. They're just bad." At that moment, there was not a shred of compassion left in him, not a hint of his former love. For him, it became a matter of honor to maintain boundaries, not to allow past feelings to violate the law and his own principles. Sarah understood well. Nick did not take revenge. He just couldn't save her from the consequences of the choice she made herself. And perhaps he sincerely wished that she would try to get out to the best of her ability. But at the same time, he gave no reason to hope for leniency. She herself destroyed their marriage, she herself got involved with Jason, and she herself turned a blind eye to crime while it was convenient. Now comes the payback. One evening, a couple of days after talking with the lawyer, Sarah again had a dream about her former life. How she and Nick were sitting on the sofa and discussing something, laughing. The window in the living room is filled with soft sunset light. But as soon as she reached out to hug Nick, the dream ended, and she woke up in reality, cold and hard, with rough walls around her. His heart was pounding, his hand was frantically clutching the blanket, and his words were ringing in his head. Bad guys are not heroes. This refrain sounded more and more often now, like a quiet echo echoing with pain. She thought, was it really that obvious? Was it really possible to just stop? I couldn't find the answer. Yesterday's wishes do not change the weather, and in this world there is no cancel button. When the evening came before the official court hearing, which would consider the question of the degree of restraint and the extent of cooperation, Sarah was again taken for a short walk in the courtyard, if this concrete well could be called a courtyard. Half an hour in the fresh, albeit chilly, air is part of the regime procedures. After the walk, the prisoners returned to their cells, some had dinner, others sat with their eyes fixed on the wall. Sarah understood that the judge would soon determine whether she would wait for the main trial in prison or be sent to another federal colony. And in any case, even with cooperation, years of your life will most likely be spent behind bars. So this is how it all ended, flashed through her head. Returning, she sank down onto the same hard bed, wrapped her arms around her knees, and stared out of the only high window overlooking a narrow piece of sky. It was already dusk outside, and the orange glow of the lantern on the roof of the prison was reflected in the glass. There was a cold draft from the window. She looked into emptiness for a long time. No trees or houses were visible outside the window, only a piece of gray sky and the blurry outlines of a turret with searchlights. It seemed that dozens of indifferent eyes were looking from there who did not see her as a person, but only as prisoner No. So and so. I remembered Nick's last words. They sounded either painfully mocking or alienated. I warned you, Sarah. Bad guys aren't heroes. They're just bad. And now, when there was emptiness outside the window, and she herself was within four walls, Sarah understood that she had long ago lost all the brightness that she so craved. Instead of adrenaline and romance melancholy, instead of freedom cages and guards, instead of a loving, I love you, a cold, I can't help you. Tears came to her throat, but could no longer find a way out. She cried so much during this time that it seemed that nothing could bring her back to her old life. How many times did she turn over options in her head? What if she had just gone to Nick and said, I don't have enough warmth, and not rushed to a dangerous extreme? What if I had realized earlier that Jason was just hiding behind a beautiful shell? But fate did not know the subjunctive mood, and bitter thoughts did not make the stone walls any less cold. The small square of the window gradually grew dark. The night was swallowing up the last of the light, and Sarah was overcome with a sticky fear of what awaited her at the hearing tomorrow. But fear was no longer the main thing, but a feeling of emptiness, as if everything that was dear to her had been burned out inside. It's my fault, Sarah whispered under her breath, wiping away a lone tear with the back of her hand. I chose this road myself. Looking at the glass, behind which neither the city lights nor normal life was visible, she felt that her last hopes were also dissolving. Nick left, the lawyer directly spoke about the real term, and Jason ran away, abandoning her as an unnecessary part of a criminal scheme. Everything she raved about love, passion, adventure turned into ruins. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of footsteps was heard, echoing through the corridors. In prison, they go to bed early and rise early. Tomorrow, there will be the same mechanical routine. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to cling to at least some warm memory of being in her house, laughing with Nick, making pancakes for breakfast, and dreaming about the future. But she only saw a picture of cold glass that separated her and Nick during their last meeting. Bad guys are not heroes. They are just bad, it repeated in my head once again. Somewhere inside, under the pain and fear, a belated gratitude to Nick emerged for the fact that at least he had not violated his principles and had not fallen into the abyss with her. Perhaps this is a bitter understanding, which will still give her the strength to live through what lies ahead, albeit with a prison sentence, but with the awareness of a lesson. Sarah opened her eyes and looked out the window. The sky behind the bars completely darkened. Neither the stars nor the moon were visible. Outside there is only emptiness, a lonely lantern, and the shadows of the walls. She herself felt the same emptiness inside, and she knew that many more nights would pass before she found the courage to look into the eyes of life, in which there was no longer any place for illusions. Time moved so slowly in the cold cell, and Nick's words kept ringing in her head strange, but in the depths of her soul she hoped that someday she would forgive herself and him, and he would forgive her, albeit from a distance. But now all this was just a faint shadow. In reality, outside the cell window lay a gray night emptiness, reflecting what reigned in her soul. She was left alone, face to face with her memories and future verdict. And this ending was, it seems, the most terrible of all that she could imagine. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.